Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the fifth session of Transform Smart Cities and Communities, and welcome. My name is Pierangelo Rosati. I'm assistant professor in business analytics here at DCU Business School, and I will be the MC for today's session. As some of you may know, the Transform series is a new free online seminar series that explores the growing impact of digital transformation and on business and society. The series will cover overall 6 areas ranging from the future work to smart cities to circular economies and many more. Today's session will specifically look at smart cities and smart communities, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Robert Sanders, information specialist at the Institute for Research and Innovation in Social Services, and James Noakes, a city innovation broker at Belfast City Council. For the audience, feel free to send your questions during the talks using the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your screen. Please note that the chat is disabled, so you will only be able to use the Q&A function. With no further delays, I'll hand over to our first speaker. So Robert, welcome and thanks for joining us today. You should be able to share your slide and get started anytime you're ready.
Okay, thanks. Cannot start screen share while the other participant is sharing.
Yeah, it should be fixed now.
Okay, is that sharing? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
All clear. Thank you.
So yeah, I am going to speak today about digital exclusion. So up until the pandemic hit, I think a lot of us barely thought about the internet and connectivity unless it stopped working. It's kind of like an always present thing. It runs constantly in the background, and it's kind of taken for granted because it's so central to how public, economic, and social life functions now. In a really short period of time, it's transformed how we work, communicate, consume, learn, entertain, access information and public services, for most of us anyway. So while it's integral to pretty much everything, there is a divide between those with digital skills and tools, those who are connected and those who aren't. And on a fundamental level, this means limited or no participation in what most of us would consider normal daily activities, and it affects a surprisingly large number of people. And the risk is that these barriers increase and the social and economic divide widens. And I'm going to talk in generalities quite a lot because it's a short presentation and it's basically just an overview of the topic, but there are wide-ranging implications for people that go beyond just watching something on Netflix or doom scrolling Twitter. So when I talk about digital exclusion, what this means in real life, it's families with pay-as-you-go phones as the only internet source, and that can mean having to choose between food and data because half of a weekly household budget can go on topping up credit. It's older people who can't get on a council COVID shielding list because you have to register online. It's women affected by domestic violence who are already isolated and don't have access to support. It's asylum seekers with new babies who can't access healthcare services on their own. And these aren't not particularly new problems, but I think until COVID forced everybody indoors and online, there have been a lot more conversations taking place beyond these affected communities. I just want to say before I go on that this is based on a paper I wrote, and it's aimed very much at a social care audience, and it was very focused on Scotland and the UK. But the situation is much the same in the Republic of Ireland, across Europe, Australia, North America. And if you want to go a bit more in depth in some of this, you can have a look at the paper afterwards. So what is digital exclusion? The basic metric of exclusion and inclusion from a social policy perspective was, and to an extent it still is, how much and how often someone uses the internet. And it's a fairly loose concept, but it has grown beyond just internet usage from like a simple user, non-user classification to looking at different levels of use and skills divisions. And if you were to look it up in a journal or an academic paper, it will say something like, where a section of the population have continuing unequal access and capacity to use information and communications technologies that are essential to fully participate in society, which is a really long-winded way of saying there's barriers. So the flip side of this is digital inclusion, which is about working with communities to address these barriers. And there's loads of different terms used: digital participation, digital capability, digital literacy, and they're often used interchangeably, but essentially it's just about it's people being able to use technology in ways that enhance their lives and also helps overcome other disadvantages they might be facing. And I also want to quickly mention social exclusion, which is a kind of similar, it's a similar concept, but it's much wider. It's fairly complex and all-encompassing. And it's been introduced to and adapted across loads of different fields like health and economics, and it looks at all disadvantages faced by particular groups, people who can't or don't fully participate in what people would call mainstream society, I suppose. And some see digital exclusion and inclusion as a way to combat social exclusion, which it can be, but quite often when offline inequalities aren't considered, you just see the same issues and barriers replicated online, whether that's by access, design, or implementation. And while it seems fairly obvious there would be a relationship between social exclusion and the digital world, given how intertwined society and technology are, it's still a fairly unexplored area. So who does it affect? There is a concentration of certain demographics within the digitally excluded. Employment status, education, and age are reasonable predictors of whether or not a household will have internet access. Non-users are more likely to be older, less educated, unemployed, disabled, socially isolated. So the socially isolated tend to have more limited access to and use of the internet devices and online services. The economically disadvantaged also have limited access, but they are more likely to go elsewhere, like a library or a friend's house. And those that fall under both categories, not surprisingly, are the most disadvantaged and have little or no use of the internet at all. Older people consistently make up the largest proportion of internet non-users and those lacking digital skills. Survey responses from a Citizens Advice Scotland survey showed that of those over 65, about half never used the internet, and over a third can't use or have difficulty using a computer. And figures vary slightly over and under, but around half of those who don't use the internet have a long-standing illness, disability, or infirmity. And while the percentage of disabled adults not using the internet is declining, it's still much higher than those without a disability. Outside of those two groups, there's been an increased focus on younger people. So in the UK, about 700,000 children between 11 and 18 only have internet access at home through a phone, which is about 12%. It's a massive number. And a further 60,000 have no internet access at home at all, which something staggering. And when you start to dig deeper, you realise that there's pockets of people scattered through society who would benefit most from the digital world, and these are the ones who face the biggest barriers to getting online. People who are homeless make surprisingly widespread use of phones and the internet, and it's almost as much as the wider population. Their experiences of use and difficulties and barriers are very different. The prison population serving a prison sentence can often mean being excluded from changes in technology and software, which creates a real risk around reintegration into society when they're released. People who live in particular places are affected, so areas with poor or no broadband and mobile infrastructure. These are likely to be rural, remote areas, small towns, villages, and they often face the double disadvantage of having limited access to the real world services and online services. And like most of the issues over the past year that have been highlighted by COVID, things like food, education, transport, housing, the common denominator for most of those affected by digital exclusion is poverty. there's a very strong relationship between poverty and internet use. So the lower socioeconomic groups, they are much less likely to be able to and feel confident in using the internet and computers. The Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, which is a tool for identifying areas with high levels of deprivation in Scotland, shows internet use among the most deprived in Scotland around 50% compared to 80% for the least deprived. So it's a massive gap. And the Citizens Advice Scotland survey that I mentioned earlier, they found about 1 in 5 respondents from most deprived areas were able to use a computer. So that's 4/5 who don't. And the scale of exclusion is probably much higher than you think. There are about 15 million people in the UK who either don't use or are very limited users of the internet. And again, Citizens Advice Scotland found about 1 in 5 of their survey respondents never used the internet. And to give you numbers, in 2018, about 8% of adults in the UK, which is about 4.5 million people, were estimated to have no basic digital skills at all. And a further 12%, which is another 6.4 million people, were estimated to be missing at least one of the basic digital skills. And I'll talk a wee bit more about digital skills shortly. And numbers have been getting better over the years, but the rate of progression of people moving online and gaining skills is slowing. And like even in a best case scenario, research, there's a couple of papers I've looked at, the Good Things Foundation and the Centre for Economics and Business Research. They suggest that even best case scenario, there's about 7 million people still lacking digital skills by 2028, and this despite the training and money that's been put into it. So why does it matter? I'll briefly mention the social capital side of things. So despite the cliches, research suggests that people who are online create and maintain more social ties, expand their social engagements, interactions and attachments. It minimises isolation, loneliness and depression, particularly among older people who are 3 times less likely to be socially excluded if they have internet access. And for people with disabilities, it's a way for them to have a private life that's separate from both their disability and if they have carers, the carers. So on a basic level, it's important for helping people stay in touch, learn things, access entertainment, but nationally it's of huge importance for social equality. And if you prefer the brutal economics of things, the financial cost of the digital divide to the UK economy is massive, £22 billion a year, and that's through things like loss of earnings, loss of taxation, loss of skills. So the Centre for Economics and Business Research, they found 5 areas where people with basic digital skills benefit over those who don't, and that's increased earnings, higher employability, cheaper shopping, which is tied in with the poverty premium, where people on low incomes pay more for basic goods and services. It's improved communication and it's time saved by using online services. And I mentioned earlier the impact on younger people. So the shift or the increased use of digital platforms and computer-focused resources in education has basically shifted a cost from schools onto families. And that comes with the assumption that it's a burden families can afford to take on, and that's before you get into the conversation where they should have to take it on. And even before lockdown highlighted the digital divide in homeschooling, young people with no computer, limited or no internet access at home were at an obvious disadvantage. And in the short term, that's its ability to do homework and complete schoolwork, but longer term, it's likely to affect education and employment outcomes. And the other serious problem that comes from digital exclusion is accessing key services. So as I said, things are increasingly moving online or digital only. And this was before COVID and lockdowns. And if it was just about watching one of the new Star Trek series or something like that, you could probably, but still uncharitably say tough. But when it's When it's about accessing key services like banking, government and council services, healthcare, it has serious implications for people's basic rights. And I'll bring it back to the real world again. So this is a lack of private secured internet access, which leaves people using their friends or public computers to access bank accounts, get medical advice, attend doctor's appointments, fill out benefits claims, access support services. It's people who just don't have the basic skills to even download, save, or complete online forms. It's people forced to navigate services on phones that aren't designed for mobile use. And like on that last one, so I've got an example from the Sheriff Courts here. There's a claim form people fill in when they want to make a claim or explain their case circumstances, and it's 11 pages of notes before you even have to enter any information. And that information goes in a text box, and if you've ever tried to put large amounts of information in a text box on a phone, you know it just doesn't work. So yeah, the people who most need to use health and social care and support services, older people, people with long-term conditions and disabilities, people living in poverty, these are the ones least likely to be able to use digital services. So without tackling digital exclusion, the risk is that any kind of digital transformation that's taking place just widens inequalities. So what are the barriers? The main reasons people give for not having internet access in their household are they don't need it, and that's by a huge margin, and below that it's they lack the skills. So for a long time, the solutions to removing barriers in policy and practice, they've focused on three things: skills, access, and motivation. Skills. So technology changes and develops constantly, and many people feel left behind and just stop engaging with the digital world, particularly older people who can feel it's too late in life to start learning, or as they've managed so long without a computer or the internet, they don't see a reason to start. So an Office for National Statistics report shows that the percentage of people without disabilities identifying skills as a reason for being offline is almost double that of those without disabilities. Access is probably best considered in terms of affordability, availability, and design. So in terms of affordability, Citizens Advice identifies the most common barriers to internet use as financial, which is basically the cost of computers and phones, the price of broadband and data plans. Availability is, it means those without a computer or internet at home, they're reliant on libraries or friends or family. So the lack of privacy and constraints around time, being reliant on others, creates a lot of problems. I mentioned place again. For Scotland, it's particularly important because we have a much more rural landscape, and internet usage, partly because of this, is lower than it is overall in the UK. So for example, the Highlands, about 20% of adults have never been online. And design. Design's important in a number of ways because it's sites being accessible on mobile devices, it's design of devices themselves, and that's hugely important when it comes to people with disabilities or older people, and you have to consider things like sight or hearing problems, physical dexterity, and using a keyboard or a mouse, how information is presented on screen, colour, size, layout, text. At best, this is off-putting for people with disabilities. At worst, it makes services and websites totally unusable. And the final one, motivation. So motivations, it's often highlighted as the most significant now. It's persistent and hardest to address. And it breaks down, like people say, it's not for me, so they don't see the need or the benefit to be online, or they'll say, I don't have the right support. And it's kind of about confidence, or it's too complicated, and that's people who just feel they lack the skills and understanding. So basic digital skills. So for a number of years, the focus of support has been on helping people develop basic digital skills. And there are variations depending on which country you're in or which organisation is doing it. but they usually cover the same things, which is foundational skills like turning on your computer or updating your password, managing information, so using a search engine or bookmarks, sending emails, transactions, which is like buying something from a website or installing an app. And again, there's a caveat here because not everyone agrees that basic skills should be the main focus now. And I think there's a level of familiarity and intuitiveness to technology that wasn't there 10 or 20 years ago. And for policymakers, teaching digital skills, it's an easy way to prove they've done something. It's an easy measurement for them. And arguably, any success should be seen more in outcomes like health or employment, which is much more difficult for them to measure. Yeah, so the evidence from the digital skills courses show it does work, depending on how it's done. So if it's local or informal, or if it's in a supported space, or the training it's relatable or focused on their motivation or personal hooks, then it works. And I want to mention one particular source of support. So libraries are probably one of the most talked about services when it comes to digital inclusion. So about half of UK residents have a library card, and about a third living in the most disadvantaged areas visit their library regularly. And trained library staff and volunteers have been massively important to digital inclusion by offering training and helping people use the internet and online services. And they tackle the barrier of access because we provide free Wi-Fi, computers and other technology. And I think the last survey I've seen, I think most people in library services see the demand for this kind of support increasing, particularly people like job seekers who want to use computers to look for work or apply for benefits, but only about half of them see the local authority providing the resources and staff and training they need to deliver this, and that's off the back of obviously years of widespread library closures across the country. And although libraries are very successful in this, it's not always appropriate. There's limits in time, there's a lack of privacy and lack of appropriate help. And I think what's been found is that librarians aren't experts in the benefit system or the health and care systems, but they often by proxy end up as such. And there's a particular issue with homeless people who accessing libraries because you need a fixed address for membership, which usually prevents them accessing any of the services. So getting towards the end. So thinking beyond digital skills, so figures show there's been a slow progression towards inclusion, but I think it's important to note that not using the internet and being digitally excluded can be two different things, and don't necessarily mean the same thing. And changes in trends over time and differences within populations. So again, it's important to note that targeting people who are excluded, it needs to be tailored and it needs to be adaptable, and you need to be able to change it over time. It's like digital exclusion is complex. They are essentially what we call in health and care a hard to reach population. So it usually means there's no one easy solution for all of it. So a few organisations have suggested a rethink on this move from like engagement into action. And the focus needs to be on building capacity for digital inclusion, digital skills across the board, rather than just aiming it directly at the intended beneficiaries. So that means embedding it across all types of public, private, community sector, social support programmes, workplaces, schools, community programmes. It needs to be continual and long term, I think, for it to work, so that it reaches people when they need it. And on a purely practical level, it's about better and more affordable access to the internet and digital devices. And that's not just for those isolated at home or those in low incomes, but it's homeless hostels, it's day centres, it's schools, it's libraries. And I think The responsibility of addressing the supply and cost barriers, it needs to be moved away from the individual or support organisations and onto the key players such as tech companies, broadband providers and governments. And like the argument's been made over the past 2 years ago, and it resurfaces every now and again, that the broadband infrastructure is so fundamental that it needs to be treated as a national utility and a public service rather than a service somebody pays for. And so in this context, just to finish up, what shouldn't be forgotten is that even as digital exclusion falls, there's always going to be a core group at any given point who cannot or will not engage digitally. And what's crucial is that at a minimum, key services continue to have alternative offline options, whether that's paper forms, whether it's a phone number where somebody answers the phone, whether it's an office that's staffed by people they can go to. Because I think without this, we're basically just accepting that people fall through the cracks and are forgotten about. And that is me, rattled through that very, very quickly.
All right, thank you very much, Robert. So I was just wondering, there's a bit of an echo. I was just wondering what, if you have any good example of initiatives that have been undertaken to try to bridge this gap in terms of digital skills, particularly in maybe in rural areas when there seems to be an issue that is affecting essentially how people can access to different services and so on.
Yeah, there's loads of examples throughout the country, and again, they all teach the same basic skills, and they all kind of take the same approach now, but they tend to be more successful when they're targeted at particular groups. So whether that's like the homeless population or the Bangladeshi community, for example, there was a real push in London to involve them, because traditionally they're not, they don't engage with digital health services as a community. So there's a real push to get them involved. So yeah, there's lots of different approaches.
Okay, we have a question here. Is the lack of digital skills within certain communities an hindrance to digital transformation for state agencies that serve those communities?
So is that a CUNY? Is the lack of digital skills an hindrance to digital transfer state agencies? Well, yeah, I'm assuming by state agencies you mean like councils and healthcare providers and things like that.
I'd say so.
Yeah, very much so. And like I said, it's a huge number of people. So when you say, I was surprised it was like something like 15 million people. So like things like healthcare, as I said, there's problems with homeless people, there's problems with older people, disabled people accessing basic services, and it's beyond just access, and it's more about your basic human rights. And I think that's an approach people are going to start looking at it through, is the human rights approach.
All right, thank you very much, Robert. I'm just conscious of time, so we'll keep going with the second speaker, and then in case any question comes through for you, we can address that later on if you are available to stay on the session until the end. Thank you very much. So I will pass now the stage on James Noakes, Seed Innovation Broker at Belfast City Council. Welcome, James. Are you with us? Yeah. So you should be able to.
Good afternoon.
Hi. You should be able to share your screen and start with your slides anytime you're ready.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yeah. Very clearly.
And can you hear me? Okay. We've had some issues with sound. But...
No, audio is good.
Okay. Thank you. I suppose I could have a bit of insight in terms of that question that was posed. It's a real challenge when you're trying to develop what people would refer to as a smart city, when parts of the population don't feel that they're included in that. A friend of mine said, even the phrase smart city begins to exclude some people because they don't feel smart or they're worried if they are. And certainly when you start talking about, digital transformation and all the great things that are going to happen, that digital exclusion, which Robert's just talked about, looms large. And it is a definite challenge. And we have to bear in mind that when we change services or the types of services that we deliver, that there are some people that this begins to exclude. And it's something that we're very conscious of in Belfast, and certainly I was in my previous role as well. There we go. So that's just a little bit about me. I feel like I should first apologise for my incredibly red face and terrible hair. Something about Zoom makes me red for some reason. And the hair, well, we've all got it at the moment. So that's kind of my background. I work in the City Innovation team in Belfast City Council, and essentially we're the kind of smart city team. We do actually work quite closely with our counterparts in Dublin and other parts of Ireland as well. But prior to that, I was an assistant mayor, so I was one of those horrible elected politicians in Liverpool. I had responsibility for things like waste and highways and bins and all the things that people want to complain about. So that was my responsibility. And it's funny enough, something Robert said about the role of libraries. It's crucially important when we talk about digital to talk about libraries as well. In the ward that I represented, we had the second most popular library in the city, the first being the main one in the city centre. And it was popular because people used the computing facilities. And there are certain issues that have come about because of COVID and the pandemic about the kind of access that people have got. I mean, even bidding for houses, for social housing, stuff is all done online now. It's really difficult for people if they're excluded. So there's a lot of challenges, and you can read whatever you wish about me. Belfast itself, if you've not been, I do encourage you when you're allowed to. I do encourage you to go to Belfast and to see the city. Belfast, for obvious reasons, has got a bit of a reputation amongst some people, but it's genuinely a very changed city. Before I moved to Northern Ireland, I'd been to Belfast many times, and you could even see the transformation then. It is a very different place, and it's a very forward-looking place, and we're trying to be a much more innovative place. But it's genuinely a place that lots of things are going on. In terms of the kind of the digital cluster for Belfast, there's a lot of organisations represented and a lot of things going on. Just to give you a bit of insight there, the 10% of global foreign exchange going through City Group in Belfast. The Centre for I can't remember what CSIT stands for now, but basically cybersecurity centre. Belfast is very good at that as well. So there's a lot going on and a lot that we can build upon in terms of developing it as a kind of smart city. And we obviously, as a city, have some challenging targets for ourselves in terms of what kind of place that we want to develop. Belfast, unlike, say, other major UK cities, hasn't really developed city centre living as much. And so there's a lot that we can still do. There's a lot of benefits in terms of when you grow the population, you look at the city centre, but there's also challenges. I mean, I could throw off the top of my head, we don't have the wastewater facilities that we need in order to deal with that. So all of these aims that we have and the objectives we work to, they bring a lot of excitement, but also a lot of challenges at the same time. So is Belfast a smart city? I suppose that we never really talk about whether it is. We never really talk about it being a smart city, but we just want to continually be smarter. And some of that is about using technology and digital, etc. But mainly, it is a city that is delivering for the people who live there, work there, visit, etc. That quote that I've got there at the bottom of the screen is something that an Indian delegate to a smart city conference a few years ago said to me. for some people, it's just developing those basics would make them a much smarter city. So we have to be mindful that when we're developing the city, that it isn't just about the technology. We can't just take the city and dump a load of technology on it and go, look how great we are. There are some examples of that happening around the world, but they can, to a certain degree, they can feel quite dystopian and quite removed. So we've got to develop the city as organically as we can and make technology work for us and not the other way around. I'll just skip on from that, but there's a lot going on in Belfast. There's a lot of investment happening. I mean, some of this is going to be challenged by the situation that we're all in with regards to COVID. But we also recognise that some of the things that we are trying to develop will also assist with the recovery at the same time. So as Robert has pointed to, digital exclusion, well, we're looking and seeing, how can we include people in all of these different projects and programs that we've got. One of the things that we were developing is the Citizens Office of Data Analytics, which is, how do we make data across the city work better for us? But importantly, how do we ensure that people are engaged in that? And there's actually a big education challenge with that. You get an awful lot of education of people in terms of how they can better use social media, for instance, but very little in terms of education for what data are you actually giving away, what is data, etc. There's actually a really good, it's a bit of a sales piece. There's a really good a document produced by Apple a couple of weeks ago, A Day in the Life of Your Data, which gives some insight. But we recognise that it's one thing to kind of educate people. We've got to definitely include them as we develop all these different projects. One of the things that's been really big for us recently has been a city deal. For those who don't know, the UK government has agreements with a range of different UK cities for something called city deals. And that is about how do you devolve both finance and power, I suppose, to the local level and how to develop that. Now, as Northern Ireland, because we have our own form of government as well, sitting between ourselves and Westminster, ours is very much focused on digital and innovation. And the part that my team works on is around the digital element. They're both about digital, they're both about innovation. It's just the way it's named. But ours is around the digital strand, and you see some examples of what we're trying to develop there. Smart district. I mean, as I say, we work closely with partners in Dublin. We've got good friends there who are developing the different smart districts that you see around Dublin. So we're taking some of that learning as well. We're very conscious of the wider Belfast City region, and so we've got to develop networks there that enable people to take advantage of all these different developments, but also to innovate themselves. We recognise we've got to invest in infrastructure at the same time. And the Digital Innovation Platform Partnership is slightly changing. That's becoming much more about, the governance of this all and how do we engage different people in the approach right away across the city region. So there's some really exciting stuff going on. It's about £350 million being invested, which is meant to unlock around about £1 billion worth of investment. The other strand, the universities are responsible for, and they're developing things around media, advanced manufacturing, innovation as well. So it is a big project. It is a big approach, but it's something that we feel that we need to develop. The smart district itself, just to touch upon that, that is about. I wrote a piece on what is a smart district versus an innovation district, and I know a friend of mine, Michael Guerin, Smart Docklands in Dublin, he developed it further about analysing, what is the difference. There's an awful lot of talk about innovation districts, but for me, they're not really rooted in place. For us, the smart district is about that place-making issue. How do you include people in developing this? And we do see both the challenges, but also the opportunities that things like 5G represent for us as well. That improved connectivity, what can that unlock for people? Now, some of those use cases are still being developed. I was involved in one in Liverpool, which is around social care. But yet we recognise that we're still early days in terms of how we make use of that. But we do recognise also that that advanced connectivity is really important for the city and for the developing those opportunities. And that urban innovation sandbox, I mean, that's about, on one level, I suppose it's quite boring. It's all the regulatory stuff, but it's about approaching it and saying, well, if there's regulations that get in the way, how can we develop projects and programs which are as open as possible so that the regulators themselves can see how they develop and they can change the regulations at the same time. So there's some real challenges, but some real great opportunities at the same time. And I suppose one thing that we want to try and do as a team ourselves is develop it as a centre of excellence, whether that's a centre of excellence for Belfast, for Northern Ireland, for further afield. We want to develop Belfast as a place where we're able to welcome people in who want to try new things. There's a lot of different things there that we're trying to do, and it can be incredibly complex. But on one level, we've got to, part of our challenge is to try and keep it as simple as possible, because this can't be something that we just develop and the great and the good sit round tables and say how great they've done, if it's not really delivering for the people out there and that they feel that they are getting something out of this as well. But I suppose part of our challenge as well in Northern Ireland, at least, is that there's lots of different approaches to governance. For very good reasons, certain things are quite centralised in Northern Ireland, which, as someone who came from helping run a city like Liverpool, when you had those different responsibilities, it became, I wouldn't say a shock, but it was, it was interesting to see that it worked very differently in Belfast compared to other parts of the UK. We didn't have a responsibility. We don't have a responsibility for our highways, for instance. So there's a real challenge there. That's when I say fractured governance, I don't mean it in a kind of, oh, this is terrible, because there's very good reasons of why it's developed like that. But it's something that we have to be aware of in terms of the things that we want to develop for the city, because some of the responsibilities lie elsewhere. And I give the example there of the Department for Infrastructure. That is responsible countrywide across Northern Ireland, and they are responsible for the roads, etc. Whereas if you go in England, for instance, that responsibility lies at a much more local level. So there's some definite challenges about the governance arrangements and how you develop different approaches that we have to try and work through. I just kind of touch upon connectivity. That, if you're not aware, that's something called a Wardley map. And if you get the chance, do look into them. The reason I put it in there is because we've got to understand that things change, things are forever evolving. So connectivity used to be, just simple access to the internet. For a lot of other people now, it's changing very rapidly. As Robert has highlighted, there's a lot of people who are still facing that challenge of even connecting, but things change over time. So, things like connectivity become much more, at one point it was kind of digital connectivity. At one point it was very, very new. It's very niche, and now it's become much more of a utility, and so we've got to be aware of that. We would see it as a real challenge if, for instance, people weren't able to heat their homes, because that's just a basic utility. In the same way, we've got to look at digital these days. But do look into that. Those Wardley maps, for me, they're fascinating and a useful way of understanding how things change over time. From a city council point of view, we are kind of stuck in the middle of some challenges, the kind of push and pull factors that we face as a city to try and develop and try and include people. Now, on one side, there's those push factors of our finances are challenged, and they are even more challenged under COVID. Those structures change, not just in terms of our own structure, but structures of other organisations that we work with, structure of society, etc. So that pushes us and tells us that we need to implement change ourselves and be wary of the role that connectivity plays in that. But also at the other end of that, kind of the pull factors is generations change and their expectations change. Someone who voted in the UK election for the first time in 2019, if they just come of age and are able to vote, never lived without broadband. And it's those kind of challenges that the expectations that brings to people as well. So yeah, we're acutely aware, and we can, if we're not careful, be stuck in that middle with kind of policy paralysis of what do we do. So yeah, we've got to be very conscious of all these different things that are affecting us. And overall, there are some other challenges that we have to be aware of when it comes to connectivity. A lot of, I highlight the resource implications. A lot of these digital technologies, we talk about how they're going to really benefit us and benefit the environment, but they actually have challenges that come with them as well. Rare earth metals, etc. We have a challenge around governance, about how do we actually better run a city, because some people are utterly dependent on the role of the state or to get through their lives, while other people right at the other end, they don't see the state as playing a role in their lives apart from collecting the bins and making sure the roads are okay. So yeah, we've got to understand our role within that, but also the challenge of connectivity. And I am coming to the end, in case you're wondering. So yeah, in terms of some of the sticking points, this is around the sticking points of connectivity. There's plenty of them, but they also bring, for me, opportunities. How do we plan rollout of connectivity? How do we fit that into some of these big planning documents that we do have? The challenge of networks, as they become, as they're pretty much ubiquitous, who is responsible for them? So, if we've got, for instance, people will talk about things like autonomous vehicles. Well, who's going? Will that be? What's the ownership model that goes with that? Who's going to be responsible for that? And how does that work with a state-provided infrastructure at the same time? So we've got to recognise that there's definitely some challenges. And then the kind of governance. If you look at what happened with Sidewalk Labs over in Toronto, you'll see that there were some real challenges for governance there, and they're still there. Who guards the guards? As I put there, there's a definite challenge around this. So I hope that has been useful for you. I recognise it's kind of jumped around a couple of different places. But what I kind of wanted to just get across is, first of all, there's a lot going on in Belfast. There's a lot of great things happening. And as I say, if you can, or when you can, please do visit. But also, there's some real challenges that we're trying to work through. And I should point out that we are not the ones who've got all the answers, and we've got to include a lot of other people in that. So I hope you've been able to understand what I've got across, and I hope you found it useful. And I'll come back to Pierangela.
All right, thank you very much, James. There was a very interesting overview about all different initiatives that you have been working on around Belfast. But I was just wondering, you mentioned the collaboration and some sort of exchange of information, at least between, for example, the Smart District in Belfast and the Smart Aucklands and Smart Dublin initiative. So I was just wondering, given the large number of smart cities initiatives in Ireland, but also worldwide, what kind of role can play the collaboration around sharing the discovery, sharing the knowledge around these initiatives? And is there any network in place that they can actually facilitate this kind of interactions?
Yeah, there are a lot of networks. One that we particularly work with Dublin through is the Harvard and MasterCard kind of city innovation network that exists. So we do try and share a lot of learning out of that. And that's becoming increasingly important through the whole COVID challenge, about understanding how people have responded to that and the kind of things that they've been able to put into place. And then it's been really useful because, for instance, the ability to share data. We have certain restrictions in place in our country, and we can see how it works in others which don't have the kind of same restrictions. It's really important in terms of collaboration that we understand, the things that have been happening elsewhere, and that we're able to take some learning from it. But it's also important that we don't just think, oh, well, they've done that there, that's great, we'll just do it here. We've got to understand all the variables that work through there. And as I said, we don't have all the answers. We need to collaborate a lot more, not just with other cities, but also with our own residents, businesses, and others, and academia as well. Because if we took a very autocratic approach where we said, well, we're just going to do this and there you go, there'd be a kickback against that. And so we've got to ensure that we're collaborating with others in order that we go along the same journey and we're not being, as I say, kind of autocratic in our approach. We're only as smart as you know, as the people and the organisations that exist within the city.
All right, and some of these initiatives actually require a significant amount of investment upfront. And my question is, given contexts like cities like Belfast or even Dublin, where even though they are capitals and they are still of a manageable size for a capital compared to larger cities like maybe London, Paris, Milan, and so on. So do you think that the smaller size of Belfast or Dublin is more an advantage when implementing this kind of initiatives, or might be more a limitation or a challenge that you have to overcome because maybe the initial investment might not be balanced by a large benefit?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I used to say when I was representing Liverpool that it was Liverpool was a city which was large enough to matter and small enough to get things done. In that, and Belfast is the same. There's everything you expect of a city is basically there, but given its small geographic size and the amount of people, we should be able to get things done a lot quicker. But that doesn't always translate through, as you say, being able to bring in the investment. It's not linear. The type of investment, just comparing to the size of the city. Some things do require kind of large upfront cost and an investment. We've got to understand, how that can work within our city and what partners should be responsible for delivering that. We have access to certain public funds, but also we've got to be aware that there are private funds that want to invest as well. We've got to be aware about the things that they're trying to deliver. So yeah, it is a big challenge to try and corral all of that in order to deliver a lot of the different projects and programs that we're engaged in.
Right. And then one last question is, my understanding of smart cities technologies is that essentially the companies that are providing some of these technologies tend to be either new or let's say the offer is quite fragmented. So for example, yesterday we had a panel with someone providing talking lampposts, someone providing pavements, someone else providing something else. So from a procurement perspective in the public sector, for councils, I think that could be a challenge, I guess, when you're trying to implement, for example, create a smart district, and I guess your preference would be to deal with a limited number of suppliers and contractors. But then in the case of smart cities technologies, this might be a bit more difficult than other contexts. Now the question is that the case, and is that a challenge or not?
Yeah, I can spend a whole day, I'm sure you don't want me to, talking about procurement. Listen, we've got some really good people in procurement, but I do remember a government minister once referring to procurocrats, people who are very, they understand the process extremely well, but not necessarily understanding why they're doing it, and the other issues that sit around that. As someone who kind of used to be responsible for elements of procurement in a big city, I was acutely aware that in order to be fair to everyone, we spoke to no one. So, we have these rules around procurement of making sure that we're as squeaky clean as possible for very good reasons. Or you're spending public money at the end of the day, but sometimes that means that we don't necessarily know what the best options are for us. So you devise a process where you purchase what you've kind of always purchased. So I suppose one of the challenges for the team that I work in is to overcome some of those that lack of knowledge and to ensure that we're doing stuff that is really useful for the city and moves us forward and isn't always the same old. However, at the same time, there's a real challenge because, as you say, it is very fragmented out there. There's a lot of things going on. One of the things that, we can't govern what all the business community is doing, and nor kind of would we want to. However, what we can do is be quite clear about the things that we want to develop. We're very taken in our team by Mariana Mazzucato's approach of mission-orientated goals. So, we're developing our own. And Smart London's done something similar. You can go on and find Smart London's Trello board, and you'll see something similar there about developing our missions, and that's about what the kind of things that we want to deliver for the city, without getting involved too much in the detail of what we specifically want to commission. That should come later, but we've then got to develop ways that businesses and others can come to us with their version of the solution for some of those challenges that we've highlighted, and then we can take a more kind of educated approach. But around the whole city, the whole smart city agenda, you'll find right the way across the world, there are people trying to overcome this. Some really interesting stuff going on around that, and some interesting businesses which see that as a role for themselves as well. So yeah, it is definitely a real challenge, but it's not one I don't think that we can't overcome, nor is it one that our colleagues in procurement are kind of shying away from.
All right. We have a question here from the audience. It says, what are the challenges posed by privacy, and what protections are considered to protect citizens in the context of smart cities?
Yeah, privacy is really, privacy is really important. We've done some work with with Maynooth University around ethics of smart cities and our own approach. One of the things that we want to try and be the most ethical smart city, and certainly our program should reflect that. We're very aware that our data specialist in the team, she came from she's been involved in kind of data issues and open data and privacy issues for a long time before she joined the team, and we're really happy that we've got her skills and her insights in the team, and it's something we do talk about a lot of times. But there are definitely some challenges around privacy. Some of the things I was talking about, about sharing data within the city. Well, we've got a public Wi-Fi. We would like on one level to be able to understand, people are connecting to it, and where are they going, etc. In part, so I know some cities around the world were using that to understand social distancing, for instance. But we're restricted in terms of what we can put into place. Use that. We're still subject to things like GDPR. We've got data protection regulations in the UK, but we're also aware that not outside of that, but outside of our own organisation, there's definitely some privacy issues that we have to consider. So I suppose the answer is that we're trying. We have regulations in place, but we're trying to develop what we do in the most ethical way, and actually including citizens in that. And collaborating with others is one way that we help get through that, because it's very dangerous if you just implement something you haven't had that discussion with people, because you need to understand what impact it has on them in privacy, but in lots of other terms as well.
All right, so we're running out of time. So before wrapping up, I'd just like to thank Richard and James again for taking time for joining us today. It was two great presentations, very, very interesting. I'm sure that the audience will have lots of interesting takeaways from them. For those who are interested, the next Transform event will be Transform Circular Economy, and will take place from March 1st to March 5th. And I hope to see many of you there. All right, thank you again.